Okay, welcome everyone to episode 4 of Runtime Reverie with Patrick, Craig, and Armin. We're going to yap on about who knows what today.
Well, we've got a new website, right? So we used some really cool stuff in the JavaScript ecosystem, Tailwinds UI with their podcast template, and it's written using Next.js. So we deployed that yesterday, and there's always like little adventures in the modern front-end JavaScript world, I find. So we have settled on doing a static export, and the Tailwind UI template uses the new app directory, which is React Server Components driven. And
that's actually an interesting point. So both of us thought, hey, the app directory is new. SSR and Next.js is sort of a new thing with a new version. They probably use the old pages directory. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
But it turns out, no, Tailwind's already migrated a lot of their templates over to using the app directory. It's a new experimental thing in Next. Is it version 13, Pat? I think it's 13.
Yeah, 13. Lucky number.
Yeah. That whole front end space moves so fast, right? I remember us working at a place, and I remember introducing everyone to Next.js, going, we should get on this. And everyone's just going, nah, it's too new. It's not going to be a thing. And then, like, within a year, everyone's going, oh, why didn't you put forward us to work on this Next.js stuff? And you go, where have you guys been? And now it is just world dominating.
But Pat, to continue the story, tell us also why we thought about doing an export. Like, why was that even a thing?
Because we're cheap people. So static exports can be hosted for free. So normally Next.js requires a Node.js server running somewhere. Obviously, Vercel is a good fit for that. We're trying to avoid, for just little projects, a lot of cloud services now have per seat pricing. So it's like $20 a pop per person. So for 2 people, it's like $40 US, which in Australian dollars is like $1 million. So we're looking for static HTML because it's just really easy and cheap to host.
Well, I mean, the cost is one thing, but I think just simplicity. If you don't have a complicated application, a complicated use case, you're literally just trying to serve a few bits of HTML. Yep. You don't need a node server. Just serve some HTML. Just keep it really, really simple if you can.
Controversial, but yeah, true.
It's a controversial statement, but that's how the web used to work. And simple just means less complexity. Complexity is the battle you're always fighting with software, right? So if you can keep that down, that's a good thing. Anyway, continue. What happened with the story?
So if you go to runtimereverie.com, you can see the new website, which looks pretty nice. And what did we find? We had each episode gets its own page rendered. So we have to tell Next.js with I forget what it's called, like dynamic params or something like that. It needs to know the slugs of each episode. And so, it works pretty nice. And then I think we had a bit of an issue with the image being broken because Next sort of assumes that there's going to be like a dynamic endpoint for rendering images. I think it's all worked out. But yeah, the React Server stuff, the React Server components, I find really exciting because server rendered HTML is really good, a really good idea. The founder of Vercel is actually a big proponent of server-side rendered HTML. So they're leaning heavily into that, and that's partly why he created Next.js to begin with. So there was a recent blog post on the difference that they ported an app using React client components, and loaded a boatload of JSON to present as charts and stuff, and then they ported it to React Server Components, and they just it was like a tenth the size of in terms of RAM usage.
But the thing that surprised me about that conversation was, why was it a surprise to anyone? We knew this a decade ago when we decided to build SPAs and ship tons of JavaScript to the browser. So why was this a surprise to anyone that it's less code being sent to the browser? And maybe faster.
I don't think it's a surprise. I don't know. It's just it's become sort of two camps, right? You've got the back end and the front end, and sometimes they're like, even though we've got these sort of multidisciplinary teams, we've sort of got more of a person in the team who's more front end and someone on the team who's more back end, and they sort of want to have their own nice tools, and so there's a sort of fight almost between literally, where's your application? Is it more in the browser or is it more on the server? And I think the past 10 years has been the fight's been more on the browser because of a lot of like stuff around developer experience, which I think obviously is important and has made a huge difference. But some of it's for user experience. So you get the fast navigations. Like if you go to a pretty simple website, if you click on an episode, it's like instant. It feels like a native app. So that's really nice. But I think for me personally, sometimes it's like the benefits of that are over exaggerated, and it means like inheriting a lot of complexity. So yeah.
Well, it comes down to what you want your application to be like, right? Like, what's the user going to experience, right? The user doesn't care if it's React server components, some JavaScript, jQuery, or any of those sorts of things, right? They're just hitting the page and wanting to look at it, a little different, if you're looking at apps and those sorts of things. But like, to me, it was the paradigm is you're sending the whole program down, then running it, or you're just sending down the output of the program that was being run,
Yeah.
User cares about the output of it. I mean, you're still running things, you still got CSS engines and all of those sorts of things, but that's what they're designed for. So, it's always, what does someone want? The rest doesn't really matter that much. But developer experience, to me, top line thing that everyone should actually make. All right, so that you actually got different people, different skill sets, and the way that they do things. And when you get to really large, big, complicated stuff, you're going to have divisions of labor and skill sets. It's not like when we first started off on the internet making HTML pages, although that seems to be back where we're at, and then you start to add interactivity. These days, it's like we've got the API people, we've got the database people, we've got the front-end engineer, we've got the product person, you've got the designer. It's a team sport rather than an individual one. But
yeah,
better.
The thing is that those people they focus on their particular, what their job is, and they think it's like central to the whole thing. And then they sort of fight to keep it in place. So if you have a technology that removes the need for an API, like an HTTP API, they're going to be like, what? But that's what I do. So,
yeah.
And same with design, I think. So I don't know, I think for me, some of the JavaScript stuff, especially because First Cell's gotten so commercialized, I think what they're doing is pretty amazing, but they're incentivized to have the before be really complicated, because then they can come in and have their really simple solution with the great developer experience. So I think they're actually incentivized to have the whole space be really complicated, because it opens an opportunity for them.
Yeah, I think that's actually my biggest issue right now. I would much rather do more heavy lifting on the server than on the client. The code on the client should be limited to the special cases where you need some extra interactivity or something special. But that being said, the world we're in now is one where we've sort of gone backwards and forwards over the last decade, from server to client, and now we're in this awkward position where you look at a typical code base and you don't know where the code is running. It's sort of hard to know, and sometimes it runs in both places, and sometimes they don't sync up, and you have all these weird syncing issues, and it's the line is fuzzy, and because it's straddling both front end and back end, all this heavy JavaScript code gets extra complex. It would be much simpler if we just kept it to one side or the other. Right.
Yeah, and there's several factors. Like when us developers were running say a React app or Vue or choose, like it's not really specifically aimed at React, but when you've got these sort of single page applications running locally, I think of it as a like zero latency environment, or like a frictionless environment. It's like a physicist who's everything's like perfect, and like airs got the perfect quality, and like there's no sort of grit or anything that will slow you down. So like if you've got an API running locally on your computer and then it's hooking to the front end, like latency is like instant. Whereas as soon as you go to production, there's some, that latency suddenly exists. There's lag there. It becomes noticeable. So if you're on a bad connection, that gets amped up even more. So you sort of got this like worst case scenario, like mobile on a pretty shoddy internet or bad Wi-Fi, like at an airport. Then you've got like a good user experience with where they've got good internet, and then you've got this like perfect thing where like somehow everything was instant, and us developers are on one end of that extreme, and it's like, well, so we're building this thing, iterating, viewing it, but we're like in this environment that's like completely unrealistic, and so it's no wonder things when they're actually shipped, end users find that they're slow because 1 megabyte of JavaScript just doesn't affect us on our MacBook Pro or instant API access, but whereas in production it's different.
What do you think, Craig? Are you a fan of SSR?
I am, but I also think it's cyclical in nature, right? So one of the things I'll disagree with Patrick about is I think they're like Vercel's motivated and driven by the fact of taking complicated things and making them easy to use, right? So if you took Create React app, it got it going, but there was always complexities in that thing, right? And then you get Next.js, and the developer experience on that and the focus on that was just so good that you took something complicated and made it simpler, right? But if you took like the history of React, solving a very complicated problem of messaging in Facebook, of updating messaging bubbles and those sorts of things, that was a real problem of complicated systems. But by making things simpler, we're actually taking something designed for very complicated systems and applying it to a web page. Right, there's possibly a lot of overkill, but because it's easier to use, we just naturally just go for it as the one hammer in our toolbox for everything, which I'm guilty of doing as well, right? So I just find that a lot of these innovations, actually, there's a lot more things to choose from. Doesn't mean you have to choose them all. And the complicated part is which to choose from what. I love actually just generating out a static site and then just shipping it and using those complicated tools because you end up knowing a bit less. It hasn't changed any difference since the dawn of time. Like I remember when we first started, like if you could think of something with the new app-based router and where you're going to put a page and put some componentry and everything in that, how it's server rendered, and you go, and it will dynamically get a route. I did the same thing in HTML. You create a page and guess what? That was the route that it got served on, all those sort of things. So old concepts that got lost along the way just get rediscovered, rejuvenated, and go forward. I love that striving for simplicity. Sometimes you just got to have some bumpy complexity in order to get to that simplicity.
The one thing I sort of miss though is having just an API server with just some REST APIs, and then it just talks to one thing sitting on the client. That was sort of nice.
But I do love the server rendered stuff where you can just then say, I don't need all of those things, right? Because you have the API if you wanted to extend it for other things and other purposes. Like if you've got a mobile app and a web app, you're probably looking at an API of some sorts because you kind of need that. But when you actually got just a web page and you need to get like stuff out of a database, putting a SQL query into that page, that was like, you go, oh, it's so good. And then you realize, we did that in PHP. Neat. Now we can do PHP style things with React, but it just feels a bit more right, on certain use cases.
Yeah, I think so I was going to say something and then I've lost my train of thought. The one of the aspects of why a pure single page app doesn't work. I mean, this one thing first is that Facebook created React as a technology for their use. Obviously, I think it was developed for Instagram, maybe then spread to everywhere else. And Facebook's unique because they're a social media network, so they don't actually want to be crawled by Google. Like if Google can view every Facebook post and that's their value being extracted, you've seen all the stuff with Stack Overflow and Reddit and stuff getting up in arms about OpenAI and stuff, seeing all their content. So they don't care about SEO and actually don't want SEO. And so I believe the first implementation of server-side rendering in React was community, was developed by the community. It didn't come from the React team because they just literally didn't have that problem. They didn't have that need. And so service rendering up until, I don't know, 2 years ago for React was sort of a bit of an afterthought. And that's why Next.js came in and said, hey, we're server-side rendering first. You don't, hey, if you've got like an e-commerce platform, you probably want SEO. Here it is. Like, you don't just use Create React App, which has none of that. And it's not just about rendering server-side HTML. It's also just having HTTP status codes. So if I go to, say, even our simple website, and you can go /episode/1, it will send back a 200. Whereas if it goes /episode/-1, it should send back a 404. And so that's like really important for crawlers because they use those status codes to know which pages are real and which pages are fake. So, but with a single page app, every route is sort of going to be 200 with the same HTML empty div that's sent over the wire, being served with an S3 bucket. So then you don't get those 404 status codes anymore. And so it just makes life harder for a crawler. So it's not just about the HTML itself, but the just simple, does this thing exist or not? It's very, very, very simple.
Well, you simplify things too, right? Like by actually having it server run and just sending back the output of the program, you don't need suspense. You don't need the loading spinners. You don't need all these other little bits of complexity that you tend to waste your time on.
Yeah.
If you can get rid of it. Sometimes you can't, right? It's in the toolbox as a tool to use for specific things. But when you're sort of clicking around on stuff and you just want to see some text, some images, movie, podcast, less things are better.
So, folks, this ties in really nicely with another thing we want to talk about, which is the state of front end. How do you feel front end dev is sitting these days? Is it still, land of cowboys and
the Wild West?
The Wild West of JavaScript?
I hope
do you feel like things have started to stabilize or sort of become a bit more predictable in any meaningful way? Like if you had to build, here's the ultimate thing. If you had to build a new project from scratch today, what would you do? And there was some sort of web application.
You couldn't give an answer to that, could you? Unless that's giving a generic answer to something specific. I mean, I'm spending a lot of my time on React Native front end, right? And that's totally different from doing web sort of stuff. And even then, do we even need a web page? We're building apps and app ecosystems for all of those sorts of things, in which case, they're just almost unrelated. If you're building both, then you take a different approach and go, how do I get some reuse and those sorts of things out of it? To me, everything's changing. I still think it is a bit, people, that innovative spirit is just everywhere, right? For a long time, CSS wasn't touched at all. To see that evolving as a spec is great. To see HTML evolving as a spec, to seeing JavaScript, even JavaScript was basically stagnant for such a long period of time. And that just spawns all of these other nice, cool, innovative things. Tailwind was, a good example. Tailwind wasn't the first thing to come out like that. There's been many of them. It won't be the last either. I think it's a fun time to be around.
Matt, what do you think?
It's complicated because I've thought depends. Like if you're creating something where like you want to hire people, maybe you want to get you're building a business that wants to get acquired and they don't want you to have chosen closure or something like that. So it's hard because it would be hard to say no to Next.js, even though I feel like it's very complicated.
Always React, right, for those sort of scenarios.
I think React
things, right? It's the default answer.
Yeah, it's become the default, which is really interesting because I started using React in 2014, I think, and so when I first used it, it was mind blowing, and a lot of people had a lot of problems with it. But is it? I don't know. As a default, it's I think a lot of the hooks are just really complicated, and obviously React server components removes the need for a lot of that, but it's still a work in progress. That's the weird thing about React. It's like the past 5 years, this like suspense for data fetching story is still going. It's not finished, and we're like, it's the most popular thing, yet it's the most sort of beta thing. Like it's not finished, so it's this really confusing. It's in this confusing place.
What's not finished about it? Were they still?
Well, the React server components are still like a work in progress. Like Next.js are using experimental builds of React that no one else can. They can use, but it's sort of you're on your own. And app directory stuff still work in progress. They've got these like app action handlers, which are like your form can submit and then run logic on the server side. So it's like with like the use server, use client directives. It's like kind of complicated, but it's interesting. It's just, but it's not finished, which is
it never will be, though, Patrick. And that's actually, I think, the great thing about those two projects, both Next.js and React itself, is its governance of how it's been able to reinvent itself over and over through that entire journey. It stopped it being stale. When it was 10 years old, people would be still saying, "Oh, it's too new," and they hadn't realized how long it had been around. But that's only because it kept reinventing itself all the way through, trying to solve new problems, new solutions.
The problem is
to those complex. But
my problem with it is it keeps reinventing itself, but it only goes like 80%. So it's like, oh, get rid of class components, use hooks. And then the hooks have like big flaws in them. And it's like, but it's not the complete story. Oh, okay, use rect query, use SWR. And like this primitive that probably just should be built in. And so then like those things have to like, those things change and break and stuff. Like the developers of those libraries, their lives are pretty hard because it's, React is sort of this thing that's moving underneath. So it always feels 80% done to me. And that's frustrating because even though it's the most popular, it doesn't feel the most, I was going to say stable. It just feels sort of unfinished. And it's like they're just, even this next story, React server components, is like, when's it done? Like in a year, 2 years, 3 years? There's always a hole that they leave.
And I think that's why enterprise has probably found it very hard to adopt. Right, so if you look at the enterprise world, these tech options are just not the default, and they might be seen as slow and old school, but there's a reason. It's because they're just not terribly stable, and they're not, as you said, complete or done to a sort of standard, and so they're very hard to adopt at that level.
Yeah, I think the React server stuff I find partly exciting because it's like there's this great divide between running stuff on the browser and the server, and they're saying, let's do more on the server. Let's leave this client stuff lighter. And there's quite a few people in the React community I've seen of resisting that because they just like having this one world. They just run everything in the browser and everything's nice, and you don't have to, everything's immediate. You can just, I want to have this bit of state. It's just there. But so if Next.js can successfully migrate the community to more the server side, I'm excited because then maybe it unlocks other server side technology that they would have discounted before because it's a different paradigm. So that excites me quite a lot.
I would always trade off a bit of, this sense that it's complete, all right, that it's finished, right, for evolution, right? I love the fact that it evolves. I love the fact that there's change in it. I love the fact that when you go from something that was always client side and now we're throwing in something server side, that there is a disconnect between those items, right? Because the next iteration of that change is going to try and sort out some of these things. And the solution that will probably end up being adopted is something we haven't thought of yet, hasn't evolved yet, hasn't been found yet. But when it does, I'd like to adopt it, So to me, there is no such thing as complete, right? On a project that is alive and living and healthy. The ones that are fully complete and sort of sorted and have most of the problem solved are generally projects that are reasonably dead. I think to me, the ultimate example of something that's not dead but is very mature and stable is probably like Unix. But it's a set of utilities and things that don't change a lot over time because they're settled, right? But they're not innovative. I'm not going in there looking for something completely new in my use case.
Yeah, I guess I think maybe I think this is all developer software engineering. It's not just front end. You know, the attractiveness of the shiny, the new. And I think there's also an aspect where developers, if everything was too easy, they'd be bored out of their minds. So I think developers actually like things being a little bit difficult because it's a bit more challenging. Oh, cool! I get to write this custom hook. Like that's exciting. So whereas if everything was just provided on a platter, they'd be like, oh, this is too easy.
It's easy to fall into this trap of saying, oh, hooks, they got failures, they're not great. But then you go back the step of the problem that they solved, it really cleaned up that code, right? So that didn't happen.
Not the React code bases I've seen.
Look, absolutely cleaned up a lot of code on a lot of things, right? And then you look before that, that was only available to functional components and it had class components. It's, you know, better than it was. So each time adopting better, but doesn't mean you go back and rewrite history. You can't rewrite, you know, a massive scale app with, you know, 5,000 files of components and get that done overnight. You still have to embrace what was done and make it better going forward. And I think they've done a good job.
Here's an observation for you, Pat, and I agree with you. It'd be nice to move the community more back towards doing the heavy lifting on the server. That'd be great. But what I think will happen is, as we do that, as we sort of cycle back to server, people are going to reevaluate the language choices again. The reason the community went all in on JavaScript / TypeScript / other was you could only run JavaScript on the browser. So you sort of had to use JavaScript. So then you had to build all this stuff around JavaScript. Then JavaScript wasn't enough. Then you had to build CoffeeScript and TypeScript and all those things. You're back on the server. You don't have to do everything in JavaScript anymore. Maybe you should consider Elixir. Maybe you should consider, .NET Core or Java or one of the millions of other options you have, right? And I think that's also going to start rethinking choices and lead to more innovation and more interesting options, to your point, Craig. So this might be good for the broader community. It might be bad for JavaScript. And it might be bad for Next.
I can't see JavaScript going anywhere anytime. I started my career with JavaScript and then I wanted to be a real programmer. Now I'm back at JavaScript.
Yeah, maybe that's my bias. I didn't actually start with JavaScript, so maybe that's why I'm not so attached to it.
Look, you're a lot younger than me, Patrick, but I'll put a prediction down that you'll end your career on JavaScript.
I think we might probably WebAssembly more than. Yeah.
Awesome, guys. Let's call it. Anything else we want to talk about?
I mean, like I've got a thought in my mind just with the complexity in front end. Like my specific criticism of React with hooks is that the beauty of React was that it's this declarative thing. You just sort of say like, hey, this component spits out this HTML tree, and then you can compose those things, and it's really nice. The problem I have with hooks is the dependencies, those dependency arrays, and it's like that complexity is so enormous, because if people start adding like use Memo, start like trying to prematurely optimize the stuff, or use effects, like have imperative code running depending on when something changes, like that, like Galaxy Brain, like the simplicity of the declarativeness of the normal React, just spit out these elements, to like now we're in this like totally different, complicated Rube Goldberg machine of when this particular thing changes, run this bit of code. That's where it's failed for me, or maybe that's just how people are using it, but it's just like so complex, just like code that no one can easily run in their head. It's just that code is hell to me. So
it's that old thing, right? Just because you've got it doesn't mean you have to use it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I can write bad software in any language. And I can also make really bad tests with them to go. So
that's right. There's always some way to write something bad or to use some feature that you probably shouldn't be using to make the code extra complicated. Always the case. Every language.
Is so difficult. It's hard.
Always
to
quite complex.
Discipline that's really hard to learn as a developer.
Yeah, it goes back to something we said at the start. Just say no. No, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
We're not going to build that feature. We're not going to use that.
Yeah.
Thing. Excellent.
Cool.
Okay, let's finish it off. Most interesting on theme. So most interesting JavaScript library, good or bad or otherwise or comical, that you've seen this last week, or project, anything sort of JavaScripty.
Look, I'm coming back to an original one. Last week, I've been trying to get rid of a whole heap of legacy validation routines and replacing them with a Zod front-end architecture. So basically, as an API call hits, we're doing validation of all the inputs with Zod, with the type-safe library, throwing out those errors straight on, and then just using that confident coding technique of going, I know my parameters are good at that point in time, and then ripping out all the validations deep down. It's amazing how many libraries to check things exist in an old code base that has lived for many years, and just ripping them out one at a time. And then every now and then you just get I can remove that dependency. How cool is that?
That's interesting. This is node.dev?
Yeah, it's really
right.
Love it. There's a couple out there that are doing similar sorts of things. Some that are a bit more lightweight, but it's just tried and trusted for me. Love it a lot. But combined with a good architecture for how you do validation, like you can still take something good and apply it terribly, but yeah, that and a clean architecture equals cleaning up your code dramatically.
Love it. We'll have to check it out. I'm gonna look at it after this.
Yeah, it's funny. Oh, it's funny. I'll just put mine in. It's funny because you mentioned Zod. There's I think it was the past week or just a bit over, ValleyBot, a less than 1 kilobyte Zod alternative was released by the builder.io people. So that's
I looked at that and I thought, is that like Preact and React? Yeah. I just end up using it.
Because I think because Zod is tree shakeable, but if you look at bundle phobia, it's like 57 kilobytes minified, 13 kilobytes minified gzipped on slow 3G. That's like a quarter of a second. Like it's not the lightest weight library, but yeah.
Yeah, but this was all server side, right? So my front end, which is basically React Native apps, we do no validation on the front end, right? So we actually so if you hit a button to go to the next thing, we validate server side, and the errors come back and are controlled from server side, so you don't have to redistribute the app later on. But also you provide good feedback. So like if you gray out a button, you don't know why the button's grayed out, you can't go in and fix it. So you just leave it enabled, validate it at the end, and saying, hey, you forgot to fill in your name.
So much simpler.
And it's so much cleaner. So the front end is back to being a dumb front end, which is kind of nice.
That's awesome. That's gonna be a great one to look up. Awesome, folks. This was a fun one, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Cool. See ya.